goes the skipper. The right boot beckons. He swings it around. That is a captain's goal. Tough one. Oh, that's a brilliant mark by Lee Spur. The Danderland's brilliant down to Barlow. What about that ruckman to Rover? Blitz the skipper. Captain courageous.
4 bounces. 5 men kick the goal.
Hello and welcome to episode 19 of the Freo Bigfooty podcast. Preliminary final this week, and with no game to review, we're going to have a look at the upcoming game against Sydney, and we'll spend most of our time on that this week. We've got our usual Victorian resident joining us again. Seppo, how are you, mate?
Good to be here and excited about the preliminary final week.
Absolutely. I think a lot of Fremantle supporters this week would probably have very little productivity done at work. And this week, joining us from the Swans board, we've got Bonz joining us. How are you, mate?
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Excellent. And obviously last week, Bonz, you guys had a pretty good win against Carlton at the end of the game. 13 goals, 886 to 8 goals, 1462. And that score probably flattered Carlton a little bit when they kicked a few in the last quarter. What do you think of your Swans performance last week, Bonz?
To be 100% honest, I'm actually really surprised by our performance last week. 2 weeks ago against Hawthorn, that second half, most supporters on our board were pretty devastated and didn't really have much hope. If you had told me an hour or so before the game that we would win the match with Tippett and Mitchell going down in the first 10 minutes, I would have laughed at you. I'm not going to lie. It was a very good performance, especially for our midfield. It was nice to see McVeigh actually run back into the midfield. We tried moving him there in the final quarter against Hawthorn last week to try and grant us something. It was nice to see him back there full time and basically running everything out of the back half through Malcheski or Grundy.
Yeah, and obviously, it's a bit hard to sort of draw some form about how Carlton played last week. Some people thought they were pretty average, and some people thought they played reasonably well, and the Swans were just too good for them, and probably highlighted the difference really between 4th and 9th on the ladder. I mean, you obviously watch the Swans every week. How did you rate that performance really compared to probably say the last month, where you probably haven't been at your best really since the? You've had a pretty tough run when you look at the form guide that you had. I mean, apart from the St Kilda game, I think in round 21, the rest of the last probably month's been pretty tough for you.
In all honesty, I don't think it was one of our best performances for the season. We have had better performances than that. If you were going 2 months ago, like when we were playing West Coast and Adelaide, the 2 matches there, and that was when we were really at our best, and our midfield was really gut running. Even though I think the main that most Swans fans took away from last week was our midfield. I mean, it's really good to see Hanbury once again getting a bit of the ball. He'd been struggling with a few knocks and had even been taken out of the game against Hawthorn due to a knee injury a few weeks ago. So the fact that he may actually be running himself back into form is really essential if we're going to have any chance against you guys, especially over in Subiaco.
Yeah, I suppose that was a crucial part of the game, what you mentioned earlier, that with those 2 key injuries to Tippett and Mitchell, that you performed as well as you did. I know watching the game, I really thought it was all over for the Swans once I saw those 2 go out, but you just showed with that midfield group that it's still possible to play well, even without that forward structure, that you've got your midfield intact. And the way you look at the team's name this week, it's still got that real strength of the midfield and good spread across all those guys that can play on ball.
Yeah, and they really didn't. I think this week, apart from probably Tommy Mitchell, who's obviously come in the second half of the season and had a pretty terrific year, you're pretty much at full strength across the midfield. So, and with both rucks in there being obviously with Mumford and Pike, I think it's certainly, as you said, it'll be a battle of the midfield for sure. What did you think of the game last week, Seppo? Did you manage to watch much of it, or?
Yeah, I sat down and watched the full game, and like I just mentioned, it was a pretty proud effort from the Swans' point of view of getting over the line when Carlton really pushed them for quite a bit. It's been discussed a bit about the surface of the stadium, and although it was a nice performance to watch, just a sort of a tale of 2 quarters in the last there, it was just amazing to see that not one goal was scored for, down one half of the ground. So it was an interesting performance, but obviously the Swans fans will be quite proud of that. Bit unlucky for Carlton, but they obviously couldn't push any further from finishing ninth and lucky to get through, and they didn't seem too upset. I had a quick read of the Carlton board after the game, and they weren't too upset, and they were sort of just happy to be there more or less. So Swans will probably be happy to get that win and get the chance to come and play us this week.
One thing I'll actually say about Kurt Tippett going down in the first few minutes last week, it actually almost helped us in some ways. It allowed us to get a lot more run again. Whilst Jed only had 10 disposals, he's very good to the ball, and he really changed our style. It forced us to really lower our heads and look for targets in the forward line instead of just bombing it long. Especially against you guys this weekend with McFarlane and Johnson in defence, we can't really be kicking the ball long. We have to look down and try and hit up targets.
And I suppose you still had a structure there with Mumford and Pike and White running through there. It's not you were devoid of any tall targets, so you still had them there, and you're going in to the side this week with those guys still there. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how your forward entries go, because obviously you played most of that game out, and it's going to be interesting once you look at the way that Swans have actually named their side.
Yeah, did we at the game last week, Bonz, by any chance? Did you actually head out to ANZ Stadium?
I live in Melbourne, sadly. So
Oh, okay. No, I was just curious to see how much rain there was, because obviously a lot of players were slipping in the conditions there, and it was interesting just to see whether it was, whether there was actually quite a bit of wetness or whether it was just dew or anything like that. So it'd be, that's why I thought if you may have gone up for the game or been there. So
the main reason the ground was shaking though was because they had played 2 rugby matches the night before. They played an under-19s match before the seniors, and the wing were basically, there was no traction on the wings because they had the stadium pulled out over there. They pulled it back for the AFL.
yeah,
So it copped a bit of a beating then, obviously, and that's caused the loose footing. Though I heard it was almost described like players running on concrete. It was that slippery that no amount of studs would actually help fix up the issue of the loose turf.
probably a bit like the old Eddie Head Stadium a few years back when people, it was pretty much exactly the same, where people were slipping and over the place. But we'll move on to the game for this week and have a look at the ins and outs. Obviously for Fremantle this week, no real surprises there, and I don't think anyone was probably expecting anything different, with Michael Johnson coming back into the side, coming back from a calf injury, and Tom Sheridan, the unlucky one, being omitted, with Matt De Boer playing his 100th game this week. And Sydney have brought in a little bit of toe with Ben McGlynn coming back off the reserves last week, where he played in the game last week.
Didn't play in the reserves last week. He was out with a calf injury.
Oh, he did. That's right. Sorry, he didn't. It was Lewis Thompson who played last week, didn't he?
Yep.
Yeah.
And he's been named as an emergency. And Gary Rowan played in the reserves last week and didn't do too bad in the first half and has been put back into our team.
Yeah.
I'm guessing we'll probably use him as a sub on the weekend, actually.
Yeah, you'd probably think that would be ideal for Gary Rowan, just playing that half game. And obviously Tommy Mitchell out, which is a loss because he has been a really great player in the last second half of the season. And Kurt Tippett, although some people...
When he first came in, he was doing fantastic, but he's actually been playing pretty sore for a while now.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at his numbers over the season, they've drastically dropped off.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be pretty hard for anyone to maintain that sort of start that he had, regardless of who they are. And, even this week, it's interesting when people talk about, and I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit more, when people talking about, like, Tippett saying, we'll probably be better off without him. But, last year in the preliminary final, he just about pulled Hawthorn over the... he pulled Adelaide over the line last year with 5 goals in the preliminary final. So although he certainly will, he is that key target, I think he's still going to be an important cog in. And when Sydney looked their most dangerous, as you said, probably 2 months back, Tippett was firing on all cylinders, and I think he will be a loss this week, even though, as you said, he'll probably still have that ability to spread the goal kicking out a little bit more with him out of the side.
And it's interesting, just with the changes, they've actually named McGlynn the smaller forward and Gary Rowan in there, and they've taken out Tippett as a tool. So unless they're going to do some shuffling around, obviously they're banking on some smaller running type play.
One thing about Rowan, though, if he is named as a sub, he is actually deceptively tall. I believe he's 191, 91 centimetres, and when he went for the draft, he had a great leap on him as well, and he's a decent mark in the forward 50. He'd be a pretty good third tall forward, third option to really look forward to if we can get him on the lead.
Yeah.
So do you expect a late change with LRT coming in, Bonz, or would you expect him to just be there in case one of the other tools go down pre-game?
I expect him just to be there in case one of the other tools go down pre-game. It's been pretty wet over there this week, correct?
Yeah, it looks like it's drying up by the time the game starts, but there are still some showers expected on that day.
Yeah, even today though, like even the last few days, it's really only been a few very small intermittent showers. It's certainly not enough to affect the game or certainly the ground in any stretch of the imagination. We probably had a couple of mils at most. So
I don't think they'll risk LRT this week. Even if I was thinking maybe if it had been dry all week up there, but with such a large pitch in us, really, we're going to have to nurse Jeddah, Rowan, Niglin through the game. Hannabury's been coming off injury. Even McVeigh did his knee a few weeks ago and rumouredly strained a ligament, but we don't know the exact details against Hawthorn. We've got a lot of players that are under injury question marks, really, so we can't be bringing in anyone else that's really underdone.
So LRT's only really had that one reserves game last week, and that's all the game he's played since round 4 since he done his injury, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah, so he's going to come off a low fitness basis too.
He's been training for 2 weeks before the reserves game, but I'm not sure if it's worth risking him in a preliminary final.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting points, and I was going to sort of bring it up, and when we had a bit of a chat with Grover a couple of weeks ago, Seppo, I think one of the key points to this game, and I know Brereton brought it up even in league teams today, is when you look at the sides, it's not really when you get to this sort of state of the game or this point of the season, it's not your best 15 or 16 players that'll win or lose you the game. It's generally your bottom 6 players that make the difference. And that's where I think a Fremantle might have a bit of an edge this week in terms of most of their players have played all season. They're pretty experienced with the exception of a couple where Sydney have had to really sort of go to the bottom, not to the bottom of their list, but bring in guys like Biggs, who hasn't played a lot of footy, Cunningham, who hasn't played a lot of footy. And I just wonder how those sort of guys, even Andreas Everett hasn't been consistent, even though he's certainly gotten better over this sort of season as it's gone further along. So it'll be interesting to see how those guys stack up in that sort of finals-like atmosphere when they've really only probably played a couple of games of AFL overall.
You've got to stack that up against our bottom 6.
Look, there's no argument. Your bottom 6 is going to be a lot stronger than ours this week. Like, I mean, you're looking at Neil, Sutcliffe, De Boer. Then after that, it's really maybe Spur, and he's had a fantastic year for you guys. Zungu's been a great pickup from the VFL. You've got one of the strongest bottom 6s in the league, and that's the reason why you're contenders this year. If you're looking at players that are out of our lineup, we're missing 7 players that played in our grand final team last year in LRT, Goods, Morton, Johnson, Matner, Shaw and Reid. On top of that, we're also missing Tippett and Mitchell. You throw in the fact that we've got a half-fit Hannabury, and whilst looks like he may be in form again after his performance against Carlton, who knows, one knock to the knee and he could be subbed out really early. It's quite worrying, actually.
You wouldn't want to be forced to use your sub again in this first quarter, and any injuries could spell a long game for you guys. So let's just hope there's no injuries to either side and both teams can get through unscathed, because I'd hate to see an injury early in this game considering how hot and fired up it's going to be. And obviously I know the Freo guys are going to be edgy, and Ross is going to expect them to come out firing with a bit of hunger in the intensity straight away in this first quarter. And it's one thing they've been talking about with the week off, what it can do to you and if it works against you. But obviously they're going to make sure that they come out firing.
And I think last week, Bonz, I think what you said yourself, Bonz, I think last year when you looked at Sydney's grand final side, they probably didn't have a weakness down to the 21st, 22nd player at all. I mean, some would argue Mitch Morton maybe, but even then he still stood up and played well in the grand final, and you went really deep in that side. And as you said, if you bring all those guys back in that you're talking about, including like Adam Goods, Reid, those sort of blokes, I mean, as you said, that just sort of pushes those other blokes down. And I think it may, at the end of the day, be the difference between the two sides. But as I said, having your full strength midfield, or just about your full strength midfield in there, will certainly hold you in good stead for the season. And the other thing as well is, when we're talking about that third tall, Pike will obviously rotate between there and Munford, and I think Pike will probably end up playing a bit more forward. I think he's a better forward than Munford. And you've still got Jesse White and even Andreas Everett.
Pike's up. Everett won't be playing forward. He'll most likely be playing off the half-back or wing. He's been there all season. He hasn't played forward much this season at all.
I wouldn't expect him to, but at least he's still got an option there as a tall, if they needed a third tall to go down there. At least he has got the height, and he has shown a little bit in his time, even when he was at the Bulldogs, that he could play there. As you said, they may use Gary Rowan in that role instead.
And he's still got White as well there to run through and play as a forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting they've got Drew Bolton there named at centre half forward in the team list. I mean, obviously he'll probably play at half forward, and in that regard, I mean,
I think that has to be a bit of a joke with the team. So, he's a very good mark for his height, Bolton, but he isn't tall enough to be playing centre half forward. I think they've got Jesse White and Drew Bolton the wrong way around there.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, I know for Fremantle, they've really got probably two of their better defenders out in Garrick Ibbotson and Clancy Pearce, who have probably played most of the season, and I think Ibbotson was probably in career best form. But Sydney have probably got a half their best defence out as well from last season. When you look at guys like
Matt Nashaw,
LRT, and also the guy Alex Johnson as well. So so you could even argue four of their best six.
You would be very hard pushed to find a player in the Swans that we've actually missed more than Johnson. Some people were even arguing on the Swans board a while ago that he was a bigger loss to our team at the moment than Adam Goods, which says a lot about how much we respect him as a player.
Yeah, I certainly respect him as a good defender, and especially when you come up against a side we've got Ballantyne and Walters to deal with, it's going to be definitely a big task for whoever gets the job on one or if not both of them.
Yeah, and you'd have to think that...
It's going to be interesting. Personally, I think, Nick Smith will probably be marking Ballantyne. I can't see anyone else going to him, and Richards will have to go with Pavlich. It'll probably be Grundy playing on your resting ruckman and Rampy going to Walters, I'd say.
So
or Rampy to Main, and they might send, if Walters is playing higher up the field, I don't know if Bird will drop back there at all or mix them up a bit.
Yeah, and obviously
it could be Biggs as well. He's played a fair bit of halfback, flank, back pocket through the Niffle, so that's another option there.
Yeah, well, I think they've named Biggs on Walters, so I mean, obviously that might be interesting to see how they go in that regard. I think also
that's going to be a very interesting matchup. Walters is a great mark for his size. I'd be worried about that.
I think that's one, and it'll be interesting. I think they'll probably look at putting De Boer on Jared McVeigh. I mean, he's generally our defensive forward, so you'd have to think that De Boer will get that job. Obviously, McVeigh had a sensational game last week, and Carlton were unable to stop him. So you'd have to think that if he starts going well...
Malcheski?
What's that?
Wouldn't you be sending De Boer to Malcheski?
It all depends on the positioning that Malcheski plays, because I noticed with McVeigh's game, obviously the first half, a lot of that ball he earned was through the midfield, and if he does play that, obviously he's going to attract the Crowley tag. But if I think McVeigh shifted to the half-back or played loose and got a lot of the ball off there, and that's where we'd apply De Boer to play that defensive forward tag. So it all depends on, I reckon, the positioning of where they lined up, not just for a whole game matchup is who gets him. But you're right that if Malcheski's playing off half-back, it could be an ideal spot for De Boer, but we've still got some others there to throw around. What do you guys think of the likely Crowley matchup? Will he want to go to Hanbury, or obviously just be moved around to whoever's hot?
He'll be going to Hanbury. There's no doubt. If you hold Hanbury, if you look at the stats this year, if Hanbury has a quiet day, you're three times as likely to beat the Swans than if he's running hot.
Yeah, and I think that was last week.
You have to play Crowley on Hanbury.
I think they showed last week as well the stats that when Hanbury gets over 22 touches, Swans just about win the majority of their games, where if he gets under 22, they lose more often than they win. So you'd have to think that would be a starting point for Crowley. And then, as you said, if someone else gets off the leash, Lions shown last week when they moved him from Matty Stokes to Stevie J that he's not afraid to move Crowley if need be, and they'll rotate it through. I think the other interesting point will be how a lot of the Swans midfielders are a lot smaller in height than the Fremantle midfielders, and it'll be interesting to see how Fremantle utilise that in dragging whether they drag their opponent down into the forward 50, because guys like Fife and Barlow are both good marks overhead.
Kennedy and O'Keefe are both over 190.
No, those two are, but Kieran, you've got two of them there.
Literally 182, 181. He's an average size midfield, but he's still deceptively good overhead. And Luke Parker's the other one you'd probably have to watch out for. But I'd be worried about... Actually, I can't really see a Swans matchup going head-to-head with him. I think he's going to tear the game apart on Saturday.
Who's that?
Fife.
Oh, yep. Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like, even though we've got, as you said, you've got a couple of those guys who are 190, I think those guys will be fine. It's when you go through to the next lot of guys, and you said, I think Luke Parker's a terrific player, and he's actually more dangerous forward of 50 than probably some of your other guys, and you've got that grunt sort of work in there. So it'll be just interesting to see if Lyon does try and drag some of those guys forward, particularly even guys like whoever plays on Kieran Jack, because Jack obviously can, you know, some people argue whether he's an All-Australian half-forward flanker, but he does kick goals, and whether they try and drag him the other way into the defensive 50.
Jack hasn't played on the half-forward flank for nearly 2 years for Sydney.
So do you think that was funny, them naming him? It was just almost a leftover midfielder spot then, Bonz.
It was very comedic. They're just using the half-flanks in the positions to name more midfielders now.
Yeah.
Jack doesn't play in the forward line. He's a pure rover in the older sense. He runs both ways over the field, but he'll never start on the half-forward flank. We'd be far more likely to start Ryan O'Keefe there or Hanbury, for instance. We never start Jack on the half-forward flank. He'll be in centre square all night.
Do you think Bonz will play both Pike and White deep from the forward 50, or do you think they'll put White up near centre half forward and be that sort of outlet option when they bring the ball out of defensive 50?
We've been using White actually leading up the ground for a few weeks now. I can't see that changing. It's a role he plays very well. He's actually better up the ground as creating space behind him and being a target on the wings than he is actually in the forward 50.
Yeah, I kind of picked that up from the...
And that isn't to say he does roll very well.
I picked that up from the Hawthorn game, I think, in that first final, that White was playing a bit higher up, that half forward and even on the wing and running through, and he actually looked more dangerous there than he did deeper towards the goal. So it'll be interesting to see if they place him there again.
Yeah.
It'll be definitely. We'll be keeping the resting ruckman at full forward, so whether that be Pike or Mumford, and we'll be using White at centre half forward leading up the ground, or even starting on the wing, which has been happening a bit recently. We start him on the wing and get him to run into the forward 50 and hope to create a mismatch.
It'd be interesting to see who we actually put McFarlane and Dawson to if that resting ruck does attract Dawson, or if we leave McFarlane on White, if he's going to be there sort of running centre half forward and McFarlane's going to try and blow him up, running him back and forward and obviously chasing him down. But obviously Pike's going to be, I think, the most dangerous target based on how many contested marks he's been making this year. So he's quite a danger, and obviously Dawson and McFarlane love his work cut out, and hopefully Johnson can have an impact coming in as that third loose man down back.
Yeah, and I think that use of that third loose, or Fremantle always like to play the one back, and I think it's going to be really important in the way that both teams bring their ball inside 50. Depending, because both teams are ranked 1 and 2 in the league in terms of their defence or stopping teams getting a score inside 50. So it'll be really interesting to see how that third man, or that loose man, or plus one, whatever you want to call them, is utilised by both teams, and how they, which team sort of blinks first on, or whether they're both happy to play it all day and with having that loose man there.
I was actually going to ask you guys, who do you believe will be the top midfielder to really stop at Fremantle? We were talking about this on the Swan Sport a while ago, and we're trying to figure out really who to send Ryan O'Keefe and Bird to, because your midfield bat's so long. You've got Barlow, you've got Mundy, you've got Fife. You can even argue that some teams you have to shut out Stephen Hill no matter what, because if he gets on top of a game, nearly game over for you guys. Subin's back into the team and he can play off the half-back flank or the midfield and he can do a lot of damage really quickly.
And we've still got Walters to go through there. You've got Lockie Neal that plays inside, but probably not a taggable option, and Daniel Pearce as well. So there's quite a few midfielders that actually run through there, but I haven't actually, sort of reverse engineered and actually look at what sides actually do to us in terms of tagging and limiting their output. But I do know that when Hill gets off the chain, you can just see from that Geelong game that that's crucial to a lot of our goals and our inside 50. So if you were to put Bird or I don't know who else plays your tagging roles in the midfield or run with roles.
Bird or O'Keefe.
Yeah, Hill looks like the obvious one. I think Bird's had roles before on Fife, but it'll be interesting to see which way they go, or if it just ends up head to head.
Well, I think Fife's going to be. I think Fife's one of those players that's very difficult to tag. If it was me personally, I would probably, as you said, Hill is probably really damaging if he gets that open space, and he will cut you up through the middle. So I think Hill would be probably the ideal matchup, or someone like Bird would go to him. And I personally think that they would probably try and target Mundy, because Mundy has a much better, his disposal compared to Fife and Barlow is more elite. Like if Mundy gets 15, 20 kicks, he will hurt you and he'll hit targets 18, 19 times out of 20. Fife is more of a machine in terms of getting the ball out of that congestion and just making meterage. And if you he's very hard to stop getting in there. And I think Barlow accumulates a lot, but his kicking is nowhere near the same level that Mundy is. So I think they would probably try and stop Mundy getting that inside 50 delivery, because if he does get those entries, he's going to hurt Sydney, and he'll get through those. And he weights his kick so well that it will be very hard for even Sydney, if they've got that +1 there, to continually stop the rebound or get the rebound coming back out.
So you hear that, Bonz? If you want to help out Horse there, just pass on those crucial notes there that Hill and Mundy are the one to go for.
I'll definitely forward those on to him.
I'm sure he'll listen to us big footy podcasters and take it in there. So
I was actually having a look at a few of the matchups, trying to see what could happen. I was actually thinking that it could be likely that we could use Jack and possibly Barlow actually going head to head, and we could try and hurt Barlow in the opposite direction. Jack can shut down an opponent and get a fair bit of the ball himself as well. So
he can, and that's where we were talking about before, Bonz. I reckon that if that happens, if they do go head to head, I reckon Lyon will drag Kieran Jack into the forward 50, so that Jack would actually have to play defensive on him, and Barlow's probably got 10 centimetres on him, and I know Jack is a reasonable height, but 10 centimetres is a lot, and Barlow can, as I said, is a pretty decent overhead mark, and I think Jack could be exposed a little bit if he gets dragged back into that defensive 50. But it'll be interesting to see how they go with the head-to-head.
If that does actually happen and he does try to run Barlow into the forward 50, Jack won't follow him. Well, you'd almost nearly guarantee that from the Swans. Jack won't follow Barlow into the forward 50. He'll be around the stoppages nearly all game.
Well, that's what I mean. So if they want to change that matchup, or if they're going to leave Barlow just to roam free in the forward 50, then obviously someone's got to pick him up. So, and that's where they may change the matchup if they want to get the matchup they want. So that's where it'll be interesting to see how they rotate their forwards through the half. Because Fremantle will generally rotate Fife or Barlow or those sort of guys through that half forward line. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes. The other interesting point, I think, is obviously Mumford was talking a lot this week about trying to run Sandilands into the ground, but the interesting point is that if it could actually go the other way as well, where if they use Zach Clark in the middle, I think Clark's got quite a bit of extra toe than Mumford, and I think Mumford will be doing a fair bit of chasing, and both those guys last week played, I think one just about had 100% game time and the other 94%, and granted it was a bit smaller ground, but I think Clark could explode.
I had nearly 100% game time last week, I believe it was actually. One sec.
And
I know that obviously Mumford and Pike had the jobs against Warnock, and I don't know, was it Casbolt, whoever the other, or Tom Bell, whoever the Carlton Ruckman were. So I don't know how they performed, but obviously Clark and Sandlands dominated the Geelong Ruckman the week before. I think it was 53-16 in the hit-out. So, and the best thing about, like you just mentioned before, Centurions, is the work that Clark does once the ball does come to ground out of that stoppage, that he can actually break away and actually help with our midfield clearances. So that's where we can expose them with Clark in there. You don't see it too much from Sandlands. Obviously, he does his best work from the first use and putting it straight down to our guys. But I think Clark's very clever once the ball does come to ground in that midfield stoppage.
And I think that'll be.
I was actually thinking when I was talking about running Sandilands off his speed, isn't he actually a really good endurance athlete? Like, you don't usually see Sandilands out on his feet. And if he is starting to get tired, you just plonk him in the top of the goal square and create pretty much the ultimate nightmare matchup.
Well, and that's what I think they'll do. And they'll certainly, if they get, and I think, as you said, they'll probably give Clark a little bit more game time if they need to up there. And Sandlands, the advantage he does have down in that forward 50, even if he doesn't mark it, he does bring it to ground. And when you've got guys like Walters, De Boer, Ballantyne down there, they're really dangerous once that ball hits the ground. And I think that's where they could expose guys like Biggs a little bit more if that ball does get to ground consistently. So it'll be interesting. I think the other important point, you just mentioned a little bit there before, Seppo, was the fact that Sandlands is going to more often than not have an advantage in terms of the ruck knockouts. They probably won't be anywhere near as dominant as they were against Geelong, because I think Mumford and Pike are a class of way above what Geelong had. But the advantage is when Fremantle can dictate a lot of the time which matchup they want the ball to go to. So, depending on whether they want to keep it away from Kennedy or keep it away from Jack or O'Keefe or whoever they have in there, Fremantle, if Sandlands is up to his game, they will be able to determine which way the ball goes in terms of that clearance.
I suppose that's a good point there. When you actually look at the what we've just discussed, it'll be interesting to see what becomes a defining factor on the day. You've got the midfield matchups that everyone says it's going to be won and lost in the midfield, or will it be the fitness of Sydney in the last quarter that's going to be their undoing, or will it be the forward entries of the way that Swans go forward with, or will it be that ruck dominance? That I reckon that was probably one of the bigger contributing factors to our win against Geelong. So it'd be interesting to see which one of those points really plays into the result of this game.
Who normally plays?
I know personally, I'm most worried about your forwards, or small forward line, or the third resting tall is going to be a nightmare for us. Yeah. I mean, Pavlich and your resting ruckman obviously take Richards and Grundy. But then you've got Main, who is a very good deceptive mark. And whilst Rampy's been good all year, he may be called out to help Pavlich in a contest, and that just brings your smalls into it. It's going to be a nightmare.
Yeah. Who do you normally, if you do play the +1 Bonz, who normally plays that +1 role for you? Is it normally Milcheski, or do they try and obviously free up McVeigh just to play that third loose man and bring the ball out?
It's usually Milcheski or Everett.
Yeah. So obviously they've got
Everett's that role.
Yeah, because obviously they've got Everett named on the wing at the moment. So obviously, depending upon the matchups, it'll be interesting to see how they go with that. And obviously, both teams are going to come in with one guy under a little bit of a cloud. Obviously, McGlynn last week, and Johnson hasn't played for a couple of weeks as well. So whenever you bring in guys who are sort of a little bit iffy in a finals atmosphere, as you said, Seppo, you can't really afford to have an injury early in the game, because it really will make it difficult, especially in a tough slog like this one. All right, any other points you want to bring up, Seppo, for the game this week?
No, other than this, I suppose we can have a quick look at the other game and cast our aspersions on what's going to happen in the Hawthorn-Geelong game. And if obviously one of us make it through to the big stage the week after, we'll be interesting to see how our opponents go and if they're going to knock themselves out to each other. It'll be actually interesting watching the result Friday night, knowing who we're actually going to come against. I don't know if it will play into our minds or add a bit more excitement to know the opponent. What are your both thoughts on the Hawthorn-Geelong game, Bonz?
Look, whilst I know we beat Hawthorn in last year's grand final in pretty sensational circumstances, this year I'd rather to play Geelong in the grand final than Hawthorn. Easy, and that's pending if we can somehow get past you guys, which it's going to be hard enough as it is.
Yeah.
Hawthorn, every single time we're playing them now, are pretty much just bang for blood. And whilst it's grand final and both teams will go 110%, I'd feel a lot more confident on matching up on Hawthorn's forward line, on Geelong's forward line and Hawthorn's.
Yeah, I tend to agree, Bonz. I think Hawthorn are the side to beat still out of all the 4 teams that are remaining in the comp. They're pretty even across the board. I mean, as you said, sometimes it can, just never know. Like, you get an injury here or there, it can affect the side. Like Hawthorn don't have a lot of sort of help down back. And if someone like Brian Lake gets an injury or something like that, it could affect the balance of their side. I must admit, I was quite surprised they dropped Anderson this week. I thought he's been pretty good for them, and I think he adds a bit of pace that they really don't have. So it'll be interesting to see how they go. But I think it'll be one of those games where it's either a complete blowout and the Kennett curse will just be shattered, but if it gets within a goal or two, come 3/4 time, it'll certainly be on for young and old, and you wouldn't be surprised at all if Geelong managed to get over the top of them.
Definitely. Well, Hawthorn don't really have many excuses going into this game. They've had the week off. They've obviously bringing Franklin and Cyril back into this side. They're almost at, you'd say, full strength. I don't think they're missing too many, so they could obviously say they deserve to be where they are. And obviously, being the minor premiers, they've got everything going for them. So if they're ever going to break the Kennett curse that's been going for 11 games now, which is I think the longest head-to-head streak of any 2 sides against each other. I think North Melbourne and Melbourne hold the other streak for
Sydney
11 games.
Collingwood last year.
Yep.
Sydney Collingwood last year in the...
Yeah. Sydney Collingwood last year was 11 games, and that was the 12th game. So it was exactly the same scenario for in this Hawthorn Geelong one, actually, because I think they won 11 in a row against Sydney, and then Sydney beat them in the prelim.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
Well, my tip for that game is going to be Hawks by a comfortable 4 goals.
And Bonz, what about yourself?
I have the Hawks by over 40 points. I think they're going to flog Geelong.
Yeah,
Geelong weren't impressive last week against Port.
Yeah, I think the Hawks will win by about six goals. But if they get out early, as I said, it could be a bit of a blowout come the end of the and it quite often happens in those prelims. Once the game sort of gets away from a team at half time or a little bit after that, and they know they can't get back into it, they just tend to drop it a little bit further and go from there. Anything else you want to bring up, Bonz, about the Sydney Freo game before we finish up?
Not really. I'm personally looking forward to it. I think it'll be the closer out of the 2 prelims. Whilst we're lacking a bit of depth, I'd be a bit worried if I was a Fremantle supporter. Simply due, whilst you've had the week off, you also, a week before that, you rested another 10 or so players. So in anything, I'd be hoping that Sydney can get a bit of a jump on you guys and hold on for dear life in the last quarter, but it's unlikely. I'd still be tipping Fremantle this week. Yeah,
I think, as you said, if Fremantle get out to a good start and that sort of stuff and they run, and obviously the crowd will be pretty manic over here, especially, night games are pretty good atmosphere, and I know that the Collingwood game we had earlier this year was probably the best atmosphere we've had for a while. But finals, it does ramp up to another thing, so it'll be interesting. And hopefully our old mate McInerney doesn't give us too much of the raw stick of it. But
yeah, I noticed McInerney got the job umpiring this one again. I don't know who else is out there, but thank God we don't have Margetts.
Yeah.
It's Matt Stevic, Meredith, and McInerney.
Yeah, Stevic and Meredith. Yeah, I think Stevic and Meredith have been pretty solid, actually. And, and the emergency's Luke Farmer, but... McInerney just hasn't seemed to have had a very good final series, and not just for our games, but even last week he didn't seem to be that good. So, maybe it's a bit of an indictment on some of the others that are trying to get that spot. So, but as I said, I see Chelsea Roffey didn't even she's an emergency this week as well, and maybe because she didn't get anything to do for a half last week. So, it could be a bit of a disappointment. So, all right, so what's your tip this week, Bonz?
I'm tipping you guys by 11 points.
All right, and Seppo, how about yourself?
I think it's going to be... I think Sydney are going to come out with a small, narrow lead, but I think Freo are going to wrestle it back and the crowd's going to ride them home. And I think if we do get far as a 20 or 25-point lead, I think we'll just steady it and not blow them off the park. because I think we'll obviously want something in the tank, but obviously enough to control and play a bit of a tempo and just cruise through for a 4 or 5 goal win. So put me down for Freo by 21 points.
Yeah, I think Fremantle will get up, but I think it'll be about 19 points. But as you said, I think Sydney will give everything. I think, to be honest, I think it'll be a little bit similar to the Sydney Hawthorn game from 2 weeks ago. I reckon Sydney will be right in it till half time. And I just reckon that the body of work they've done over the last 5 weeks will probably just catch up with them in the second half. They played Geelong in round 22, Hawthorn round 23, Hawthorn again in the first week, and then Carlton last week, which was still a pretty tough game, particularly because they had the 2 injuries early. And it's pretty hard to keep yourself up for that period of time. And I think Carlton sort of showed that last week as well. They were just struggling when they had Port Adelaide and keep trying to win. I think they'll struggle to run the game out fully. And I think in terms of the injuries that Sydney have had, regardless of what happens, I think, whether they win, lose or draw, I think it's been a terrific effort by them considering the injuries that they've had. And I think Fremantle will go in a little bit fresher, and some of those guys like Pavlich haven't had the miles on the legs. And it was interesting looking at AFL 360 this week when they looked at the number of minutes the Swans midfielders had played compared to the Fremantle ones. It was interesting to see that a lot of their Swans, and granted they generally play on a smaller ground, but it was interesting to see the number of minutes each team logged and in the comparative midfields. All right. Nothing else to add this week, boys? Otherwise, we'll finish it there, and let's hope it's a cracking game and Fremantle manage to get over the line and get into their first grand final.
Bonz, thanks for coming on this week. It's been nice to have an opposition analysis. And for anyone actually in Melbourne this week, if you want to come down and watch the game with myself and a couple other Freo supporters, we're going to be at the Great Northern Hotel, which is on Rathdown Street in Carlton North, which is a great Freo pub to watch the game. So get down there with joining the Purple Army and watch the game this Saturday night.
You can even go down there yourself, Bonz.
Thanks for having me, you guys. Thanks for having me, you guys. I'll just say, if you guys do get up this week, you're going to be pretty hard pressed to find a Swan supporter that won't be behind you for the grand final.
No worries. Thanks for your support.
All right. Thanks very much for joining us, Bonz. And you might be able to even go down and join the boys at the hotel and have a bit of trash talking before the game. So once again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you guys next week. And hopefully we'll have one more podcast, Seppo, and hopefully for the big game.
We'll be talking grand final. Yeah. Looking forward to it. See you guys.
All right. See you next week. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye.